Old Tom Bombadil was a merry fellow. Bright blue his jacket was, and his boots were yellow. Green were his girdle, and his breeches all of leather. He wore in his tall hat a swan wing feather. He lived up under hill, where the withy windle ran from a grassy well down into the dingle. Old Tom in summertime walked about the meadows, gathering the buttercups, running after shadows, tickling the bumblebees that buzzed among the flowers, sitting by the waterside for hours upon hours. Hey everybody, welcome back to the library. And don't forget to like and subscribe because we've got great content coming at you here on the channel, and we don't want you to miss anything. And of course, this Sunday we are back on the Inklings review, and we are returning to fiction after spending a few weeks looking at the theological works of the Inklings, and we are returning with what I like to call the redheaded stepchild of Middle Earth, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. So this is a great little book, and let's go ahead and get to talking about The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. Alright, so this little book, and newer copies actually have, if you can get this copy from HarperCollins, there's actually commentary that goes with every poem. So if you like the History of Middle Earth books, basically you get a miniature history of the Adventures of Tom Bombadil collection that goes for each poem. But this little volume is the last book of Middle Earth published during Tolkien's lifetime. The Silmarillion, of course, doesn't get published until after his death. And it has an interesting little backstory, how the book came about. It starts because Tolkien, of course, was a prolific writer, even if he wasn't a prolific published writer. But he had written several poems over the course of his life. And his aunt asked him if he would be willing to publish the Adventures of Tom Bombadil poem as a little book that she could easily buy to give as presents to grandchildren. And Tolkien, being the good nephew that he was, contacted his publisher to see if this would be something that could be done. And they said, yeah, sure, we're okay doing it, but you're going to need to add some other poems. And so the original Tom Bombadil poem, which actually predates The Hobbit, so it's actually the first thing in Middle Earth that's published, just no one knew it at the time, is collected with several other poems, including one poem written for the collection, also about Tom Bombadil, called Tom Bombadil Goes A-Boating, or Tom Bombadil Goes Boating, excuse me. And he collects, some of these poems actually were seen in The Lord of the Rings. Some of these poems were just published in other places, and they were kind of tidied up, and maybe a word here or there was changed to connect to Middle Earth. And they were put together in this little volume and published in the 60s. So, again, Tom Bombadil was brought into Middle Earth by Lord of the Rings, but he's actually, his original poem and the second poem, Tom Bombadil Goes Boating, are brought further in. And then all these other poems he had written, thanks to his preface he writes to the book, are brought into Middle Earth too. For those of y'all who are unaware, Tolkien wrote that he didn't write Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He, in fact, is translating from a large, chronicle book called and he's this red book of Westmarch. He says, well, these poems are actually all written in kind of loose pages or in the margins of the book, and so he makes them as much of Middle Earth as The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are, by, as he called it, his editorial fiction. And it's a wonderful way Tolkien's mind worked, that he could find a way to bring all these poems into the world, even if they don't necessarily all or any of them really affect what you see in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but they definitely are part of Middle Earth thanks to this collection. All right, so this is what's the story, but since the collection of poems, we're going to talk about a few different poems. We're not going to talk about all of them, but there is a, just so you know, there is a preface to the collection, and then there are 16 poems in the collection. So between that, there's 17 little works here. And as we already mentioned in the preface, Tolkien creates, as he's called it, his editorial fiction, that these all came from the same source as The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. The first two poems we're going to talk about them together, are the title poem, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, and the poem he wrote as original to the collection, and that's Bombadil Goes Boating. And The Adventures of Tom Bombadil is really fascinating, and something that maybe I'll write a paper on it one day, who knows. But it is really interesting, because if this is the first thing you wrote, those Bombadil chapters in Lord of the Rings are going to be a lot more interesting to you, and you might pick up some foreshadowing prior to Bombadil even showing up on screen. But you get the willow tree, Old Man Willow, that traps Frodo and the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings, tries to trap Tom Bombadil. Goldberry, who is Bombadil's wife, is introduced in this poem. The idea that Bombadil can speak in kind of command nature is introduced here. And then not to mention his kind of silly way of speaking is introduced here. And then, as I said, with he meets kind of, it's very episodic, kind of all these different episodes. Goldberry kind of gets the best of him in the beginning before he eventually marries her at the end of the poem. Old Man Willow tries to get his upper hand on it, and so forth. But the interesting thing to me is that you see, yes, a lot of echoes in the Fellowship of the Ring chapters with Bombadil. But you also get, because of Bombadil Goes Boating, you get some things that become foreshadowing that Bombadil is going to show up. Bombadil Goes Boating in particular starts to mention very specific place names that are in Lord of the Rings. And the person, he gets in a boat, he's going downstream, he talks to different animals as he's going down the river. But where he's going to in the end is Farmer Maggot, who is apparently a friend of Bombadil's, and he goes and has a merry evening. And so the fact that you meet Farmer Maggot in the Fellowship of the early chapters of Fellowship of the Rings will clue you in now that Tom Bombadil's coming. Whereas if you've never heard of Tom Bombadil before reading Lord of the Rings, then it is like, who in the world is this guy? But both of these add, I think, a richness to those chapters that weren't necessarily there before. The next poem we're going to talk about is called Erin Tree, and Erin Tree had some particularly interesting imagery of this young man who goes on a journey. It starts with, there was a merry passenger, a messenger, a mariner. He built a gondola to wander in, and had in her a load of yellow oranges and porridge for his provender. He perfumed her with marjoram and cardamom and lavender. And there is this kind of quick pace. It's a lot different style from the first two poems, but there's this very quick pace to it. And while the story and characters have really no specific connection to anywhere in Middle Earth necessarily, there is this mariner image and going on adventure and kind of these kind of fantastical adventures. I think definitely conjures a little bit a whimsical version of Arundel the Mariner in the Silmarillion. Again, not a particularly serious poem the way that story plays out, obviously, as it leads into the War of Wrath. But I think you see that Tolkien always particularly it's another example of how Tolkien likes the imagery of the sea and adventure. So I think it's a really important poem in the collection, even if there's not a direct tie anywhere into Middle Earth. All right, so there are a couple poems I just want to recommend. I'm not going to talk about these too long, but there are three poems they get a little bit darker, and that's the Stone Troll, Perry the Winkle, and the Moolips, and also the Shadow Bride. These are interesting stories. The Stone Troll talks about Tom, and the artist, the illustrator for the collection, who's Pauline Baines, who did all the Narnia illustrations as well. So fantastic illustrations throughout the book. She didn't realize it wasn't supposed to really be Tom Bombadil, so she actually illustrates it as Tom Bombadil, which Tolkien didn't particularly like, though he couldn't, it was too late to do anything about. But I think it actually works for the editorial fiction that this is just stories hobbits have, and they've been writing the margins. So it might work that Tom Bombadil, of course, wouldn't go fight a troll and try and steal his money. But the hobbits might tell a story about Tom Bombadil that way, even if Tom Bombadil wouldn't actually do that. So I think it actually works, even if Tolkien hadn't liked it. Maybe someone put it to him that way. Maybe he had been happier. So that's an interesting one. But then you get an interesting story about a troll who tries to fit in and be pleasant, which is very different from any troll we, of course, meet. But then what is particularly dark is called the Moolips. And if you read the commentary on it, it's like there's no real clear idea what the Moolips are. They don't pop up anywhere else in Middle Earth, but it's something very dark and sinister, and it pulls you in. And the shadows where the Moolips dwell are dark and wet as ink, and slow and softly rings their bell, as in the slime you sink. So even though we've never encountered these anywhere else, it definitely sounds something worthy of Mordor. Or maybe some dark cavern in the mountains near Shelob, or maybe something to do with the dark shadows that Ugliant, or however you pronounce her name, I'm sorry, I don't have it right in front of me, but the giant light-eating spider from the beginning of time, maybe somewhere that she or her descendants would dwell. So it's very beautifully dark and sinister. But it's it goes right there with those troll stories that are both whimsical and even in the whimsy of the Moolips, it's actually, in this case, can be quite terrifying. So it shows the range of what Tolkien can do, from dark and sinister to whimsical, even with trolls. So again, another part of the collection that is quite excellent. So the last three we're going to talk about are the very last three poems of the collection, and that is the Horde, the Sea Bell, which in the preface is also called Frodo's Dream, and then the Last Ship. And I think these three really connect to both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings quite a bit. The Horde really goes to that connection of the fact that your possessions can corrupt you. It corrupts a dragon. It corrupts a king, to where it definitely echoes, Thorin being unwilling to part with his gold after the death of Smaug. It definitely echoes the corruption that the ring does to the soul of the people who desire it. So the Horde is a very interesting poem that, even though it doesn't mention the things that we are familiar with in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the Silmarillion, it connects to those themes that we see in those poems. So it's a really good poem, and I really recommend it. The last, the Sea Bell, is called Frodo's Dream, and it really, or is subtitled Frodo's Dream in the preface, and really again connects to this sense of longing that the sea oftentimes would evoke in characters in Tolkien's work. If you read Unfinished Tales, there's the tale of Numenor, of the prince who can never stop longing for the sea. It was very tragically is an unfinished story that Tolkien was working on. He had outlined to the end, but never finished the story. But we also, of course, see that with the idea, like Legolas, this moment he starts to hear the sea, he never can forget it. And the idea that Frodo needs to go on. There's something very haunting about the poem, even though Frodo's not mentioned in the poem. No one is mentioned in the poem, but it clearly connects us to, thanks to the preface, clearly connects us to Frodo's emotions that toward the end of Lord of the Rings. And then the last one is The Last Ship, which clearly echoes, again, It's not actually about the last ship that we read about in Lord of the Rings, but it clearly echoes a lot of that imagery and a lot of those scenes as the elves are leaving, and the scroll's given an opportunity to leave, and she says, I can't because I'm too much of the earth, and she can't leave. But again, thematically, it just feels like Middle Earth. And I think that's what these last three poems really do so well, is that they show that while Tolkien might, not have always, everything wasn't necessarily written about Middle Earth, like the different paintings for Nigel and Leaf by Nigel, all these poems somehow were actually part of Middle Earth all along. And even if they didn't officially become that until the 1960s, somehow they were. And so, Tolkien's mastery of language is just is fascinating, and the fact that he was so good at this language, telling these themes that were always present for him, meant that these poems are sucked back into the larger work. So Leaf by Nigel, I think, was always more autobiographical than he ever understood. And I think it proved true here on this book as well. Alright, so what are the strengths of the Adventures of Tom Bombadil? Well, one is if you don't have a long attention span, none of the poems are too terribly long to get through in one sitting, so that's good. But the greater strength is Tolkien shows off how great a writer he is. All these poems have very different meters. His love of Old English poetry shines through at times, where he uses that meter. I read you the little bit at the beginning of Erin Tree, which is very fast-paced, whereas the Moolips can bring you into this feeling of sinking and misery and despair, which apparently the Moolips will do. And then of course Tom Bombadil is Jolly Tom Bombadil. So he has an incredible control over language to produce a lot of different effects, and he does it quite often here. So the variety of style is a huge strength, I think, to the book. Also, the fact that he did add some edits before he collected them. You can see small connections to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And you can, and again, as we just talked about there at the end of the kind of what's the story section, you can, because Tolkien had all these different things that were kind of constant in his life as in his writing, there are a lot of these poems that do hearken to different parts of his Legendarium, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, or the Silmarillion. So even though the book is, as I said at the beginning, the red-headed stepchild, it actually connects, has very, I think, deep connective tissue to the rest of the Legendarium. What are the weaknesses? Well, not every poem is great. There's some very, poems written for children. Cat is one. It's a poem about a cat, and it's adorable. There's not a ton there. So not every poem is 100%. So this is true in any poetry collection. But I think the strengths definitely outweigh, the strong poems, I think, definitely outweigh the weak poems. But and I guess the other weakness is, if you're expecting it to be a collection of nothing but poems about Tom Bombadil, it's really only 2.5. There's 2 actually about Tom Bombadil, and then there's the one poem that Pauline Baines accidentally turned into a Tom Bombadil poem, The Stone Troll. Though if you get this edition, and again, I encourage you to get this edition if you're looking for one, Tolkien did contribute a poem to a children's collection that was a Bombadil and Goldberry poem. They don't do a lot of action, it's more about nature, but they are clearly in it. So you can actually get one last little bit of Tom Bombadil if you get this particular volume, because it's in the appendix to this. But if you're looking for a whole bunch of Tom Bombadil, you get 2 poems at the beginning, and that's it. So that's a weakness if that's what you're looking for. So, how do I rank this book? I love Tolkien, and I love his poetry. Even with the weak poems, I think there's so much there if you're willing to look for it. And I'm going to give this 4 stars, 4 out of 5 stars. I think it's really solid. The Tom Bombadil poems are great. I think the kind of hints at the themes of the larger Middle Earth are there. And I think even with the weaker poems that this is a wonderful little volume to read. So I think it's definitely worth turning your attention to, especially if you've never read it and you've loved the rest of the Legendarium. I think it's worth checking out. Don't leave out Tom Bombadil. So definitely 4 out of 5 stars for me. All right, so what's coming up next? Well, as I said, we're back with fiction. We're going to turn to actually Owen Barfield and the last book he published in his lifetime, and that is Eager Spring. So join us next month as we continue our return to fiction and look at Owen Barfield's last published novel, again, published in his lifetime, Eager Spring. So join us next month back for our next episode of Inklings Review. Do not forget to hit that like and subscribe button because we've got great content here on the channel and we don't want you to miss anything. So y'all have a wonderful day and we'll talk to you again soon.